If you lived through the collapse of WCW, you remember the moments that made it feel inevitable. Here are 10 exact moments we knew it was cooked. At number 10, it's the finish to Starrcade 97. This was meant to be WCW's biggest moment, the payoff of the NWO storyline that started a year and a half earlier. It was Sting versus Hollywood Hogan, good versus evil, the silent Avenger finally getting his revenge. Sting was white hot here, and the only ending that made sense was him beating Hogan clean in the middle of the ring and winning the World Heavyweight title. But what fans got instead was one of the most deflating finishes in wrestling history. During the match, Hogan pinned Sting for the 3 count, but Bret Hart wouldn't allow Dave Penza to ring the bell and demanded that he restart the match, despite Bret not even being the official referee. Sting eventually got Hogan in the Scorpion leg lock, and Bret called for the bell, even though Hogan didn't tap out. Sting was declared the winner, but it was in a way that made him look stupid, and the fans watching at the time couldn't believe that WCW had made such a mess to the payoff of their hottest ever feud. If they couldn't deliver this moment, it proved that they couldn't be trusted to get anything else right. At number 9, it's Bret Hart's WCW debut. Just weeks after the Montreal Screwjob, Bret was the most talked about name in wrestling, and fans were expecting fireworks from the Hitman as soon as he showed up on Nitro. But instead, Bret came out and shook hands with J.J. Dillon before being announced as a special guest referee for a match between Eric Bischoff and Larry Zbyszko. This was the moment that fans realised that WCW was totally incompetent. They had Bret Hart in his prime when he was at his most sympathetic, coming out of the Montreal Screwjob, and this is all they had for him. It was pathetic, and it really set the scene for the rest of his time in the company. At number 8 on our list, it's the return of the Ultimate Warrior. By mid-1998, the tide was turning. The WWF was finally mounting a comeback in the Monday Night Wars, what with the success of Steve Austin and their new attitude, but WCW's response was to reach into the past and bring back a WWF relic from the 80s in the Ultimate Warrior. It was a disaster from the first moment he showed up on Nitro, where he spoke nonsense for nearly half an hour and bored all of the fans to death. It was a terrible start, and the rest of his run in the company was even worse as he embarked on a feud with Hollywood Hogan that nobody wanted to see. Bringing Warrior back was the moment WCW showed that it had no new ideas. While the WWF was reinventing itself, Eric Bischoff was going back to his old playbook of hiring their old superstars. Instead of building the future of wrestling, he was relying on the past, which was part of what would eventually kill the company. At number 7, it's Kevin Nash ending Goldberg's streak at Starrcade 98. By the end of that year, Goldberg wasn't just over, he was WCW's biggest homegrown star and one of their biggest success stories. He was undefeated and riding high as the World Heavyweight Champion. His match against Nash at Starrcade, however, would be the moment that WCW killed their golden goose. In one fell swoop, Nash threw cold water all over one of the hottest acts in wrestling history by ending his winning streak and his world title reign. There was speculation at the time that backstage politics were at play, with Nash having influence behind the scenes, but as far as the fans were concerned, it was here that we realised that WCW had no long-term vision. They were more interested in serving themselves and their friends instead of protecting one of the stars who could have carried the company into the future. At number 6, it's the Fingerpoke of Doom. Just 10 days after ending Goldberg's streak, WCW promised a rematch between Goldberg and Nash for the title, but instead Goldberg was arrested and Hollywood Hogan returned from hiatus and took his place. What happened next was one of the dumbest main events in the history of Monday Night Wrestling. Hogan poked Nash in the chest, causing him to flop onto his back, and he allowed Hogan to pin him for the 3 count and to win the World Heavyweight title. This was a shitty enough moment for many fans to turn WCW off forever, but damage had already been done earlier in the broadcast. Because Raw was pre-taped that week, WCW knew the results ahead of time and decided to spoil them on air. On commentary, Tony Schiavone revealed that Mick Foley was going to win the WWF Championship. It massively backfired as over 500,000 viewers decided to turn the channel over to see Foley's big win for themselves. And it's no surprise that many of them never came back. After comparing these 2 main events, it was clear who respected their audience and who didn't. When Vince Russo jumped to WCW, some fans thought he might shake things up in a good way, but it turned out he was more interested in shock value and inside jokes than actually improving the product. Take the Cruiserweight division for example. Instead of developing it, Russo decided to bury it. He let his writing partner Ed Ferrara create a character called Oklahoma, which was a cruel parody of WWF announcer Jim Ross. Then Russo booked Oklahoma to win the Cruiserweight title, a championship that once belonged to Rey Mysterio and Dean Malenko was handed to this useless slob of a non-wrestler making fun of someone's disability. But this wasn't just bad taste, this was Russo showing that he had no respect for WCW as a whole. The Cruiserweight division had long been considered one of the best things about the entire show, and it was a fan favourite, but he decided to crap all over it. And from that point on, the fans knew Vince Russo wasn't going to help WCW, he was going to kill it from the inside. At number 4, it's David Arquette winning the WCW World title. By April 2000, WCW was already in freefall, but this was the moment many fans gave up hoping it could ever be saved. Russo brought in actor David Arquette to promote the Ready to Rumble movie, then booked him in a tag team match where the world title could change hands. Of course, Arquette ended up pinning Jeff Jarrett and becoming WCW champion. Even Arquette himself didn't want the title because he knew how badly this would go down with the fans, but Russo didn't care. He thought that it was edgy and funny and that it would get people talking. Well, it did get people talking, but not in the way that he wanted, because they were talking about how long it was going to be before WCW went out of business. At number 3 on our list, it's Bash at the Beach 2000. Vince Russo wanted Jeff Jarrett to beat Hulk Hogan, but Hogan had creative control in his contract and flat out refused to lose. And so Jarrett walked out and laid down in the middle of the ring. Hogan looked confused but went ahead and pinned him anyway. Then he grabbed a microphone and openly called out the situation, saying this was exactly the kind of nonsense that had dragged the company into the mess that it was in. Later, Russo came back out and fired Hogan. This shoot moment live on pay-per-view was the clearest sign that WCW was imploding behind the scenes. The fans had been watching the terrible storylines and seeing the horrible booking for months, but this was a glimpse at the chaos that was going on behind the curtain. At number 2, it's Vince Russo becoming world champion. 2 months after the Bash at the Beach debacle, WCW desperately needed someone to steer the ship in the right direction before it was too late. Instead, Vince Russo was booking himself in world title matches. On Nitro, he faced world champion Booker T inside a steel cage. During the match, Goldberg ran in and speared Russo through the cage wall, causing him to accidentally win the title. The job of the head writer or the head booker is to get the roster over, not himself. But this made it so obvious that Russo didn't care about fixing WCW He just wanted to be a TV star, and it was now that everyone realised that nobody in charge of the company had any interest in actually saving it. And at number 1 on our list, it's the Final Nitro. By the start of 2001, WCW was barely breathing. Eric Bischoff had tried to buy the company himself, but that plan fell apart, and then it was announced that the WWF had bought it instead. On the final episode of Nitro, Vince McMahon appeared on the screen and gloated about buying his competition, and as Ric Flair and Sting wrestled each other one final time, this was the moment that nobody could deny, that WCW was finally 100% cooked. For more top 10 lists of everything related to the world of wrestling, check out the playlist on the screen right now.